Dawn came in gray and cold over Iron Ridge, and the court army filled the valley below like a slow tide. Wol-yeong stood at the parapet with her hand raised, watching the column advance through the frost-pale light. She did not lower it. The cannon sat loaded and leveled behind her. Crews crouched at their linstocks, breath clouding in the still air. She let the silence hold. Hold, she said quietly. Let them commit. We only get the first volley as a surprise once. No one moved. Below, the column dressed its lines, officers calling cadence, and the mage-lords at the rear began to gather themselves for the working that was supposed to end this before it started. I had watched armies in paintings before I came to this world, flat, formal things. This was nothing like that. This was the sound of boots on frozen ground, and the creak of harness, and the particular silence of people who know they are about to be hurt, pressing forward anyway because the man behind them has a sword. Ryu Gyeom stood among the mage-lords and reached for the mandate. He found almost nothing. The thread he pulled was frayed and cold. The deep reservoir that had sustained his order for generations had been running dry for years, and he had spent what remained in smaller workings, in demonstrations, in the slow bleed of a power that no longer renewed itself. He pulled harder. The other lords pulled with him, faces tight with concentration, and what came was a sputter, a guttering like a lamp with no oil left, a shimmer in the air that built towards something and then simply stopped. Not now. Pull the thread. He could not make the thought louder than the silence that answered it. It's not enough, he said, and the words came out flat and strange in his own ears. There's nothing left in it. He looked at the wall ahead, at the cannon mouths, at the faces watching from the parapet. Something moved in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. Forward, on foot, take the wall. The volley that answered them was not a ragged crash. It was measured. Ji's hand came down. Fire. The gun spoke in a disciplined sequence, not all at once, which would have been noise and smoke and wasted powder, but in the rolling rhythm that Seo-rin had drilled into every crew, the same rhythm that had been tested against the same gauges, loaded to the same charge weight, aimed by men who had learned to read the same marks on the same elevation screws. True board cannon, every one of them, measured to the grain. The valley below answered with what it had to answer with, and it was not enough. Do-gwang moved along the wall behind the gun crews with his bad leg and his voice, and the voice was the more important of the two. He had been a smith's assistant, and then a cripple, and then a man who sat on a stool in a workshop, watching other people learn to be soldiers, and somewhere in that watching he had learned what soldiers needed to hear. In rhythm, reload, present, fire, same as the drill, hold the line, and they cannot have us. The Castoffs held, the orphans held, the men and women who had come to Iron Ridge because there was nowhere else to go, stood at the parapet and reloaded and presented and fired with the steadiness of people who had done this exact sequence until their hands knew it without asking their minds. Mokje was at my elbow when the push reached the gate, a wedge of court soldiers who had made it through the fire and were hammering at the iron-faced doors with something that might have been a ram. I felt him go rigid beside me. They're at the gate. The gate's iron-faced and barred with steel we made, Jay. I kept my eyes on the wall, on the crews, on the rhythm. It holds, don't let them set a charge. He moved. That was what mattered, that the fear turned into motion rather than freezing him where he stood. He had learned that much. The battle's mathematics were already written, though it took a little longer for the result to become visible. The court guns were hand-bored, which meant they were not truly bored at all. They were drilled and filed and guessed at, each one slightly different from the last, each one carrying the accumulated error of a process that had never been measured. When you fire a gun whose bore is not true, the powder gas escapes around the ball, pressure spikes unevenly, and the metal that was already stressed by the casting finds the weakness that was always waiting in it. The court guns began to crack. One burst outright, then another. Ours kept firing. Seo-rin moved along the battery with her gauges and her notebook, reading the fall of shot, calling corrections. Adjust 2 marks, every gun, same correction. Now they all land true. She did not shout. She did not need to. The crews had learned to listen for her voice the way you listen for a clock in a quiet room. It was always there, and when it spoke, you moved. Chaeyoung was watching the court guns fail from the next embrasure over, and I heard her say it the way you say something you have been thinking for a long time and finally have proof of. Theirs are already cracking. Nobody taught them to make them right. A pause. We didn't outfight them. We outmade them. Yes, that was the whole of it, said in one breath. Ryu Gyeom reached for the mandate one final time when he saw the line beginning to waver. He was not a man who accepted limits easily. His entire life had been built on the assumption that the power would come when he called it, that the old world's inheritance was inexhaustible. He had built his authority on that assumption. His order had built its authority on it. The court had built its authority on it. Come when I call. Nothing came. He stood before his own men, with his hands raised and his face arranged in the expression of command, and the air around him was simply air. No shimmer, no gathering. The thread was gone, and the reservoir it had drawn from was gone, and the world that had made both of them was gone, and he was standing in the ruins of it, in front of people who had believed in him, because the power had always come before. Gone. The word was almost inaudible. It's all gone. He lowered his hands. There was never going to be anything left. The court army broke. It did not break the way armies break in stories, all at once in a single dramatic moment. It broke the way things break when they have been under load too long. A crack here, a crack there, and then the whole structure coming apart faster than anyone could stop it. Officers who had been holding their sections together by presence and habit found the presence no longer sufficient. Men who had been afraid and pressing forward because the men beside them were pressing forward found that the men beside them were no longer pressing forward. The retreat became a rout, became a column of people who wanted to be somewhere else, moving fast. Wol-yeong watched them go from the parapet without moving to pursue. Let them carry it home, she said. Let the whole capital hear that Iron Ridge threw back the court with no magic at all. The silence after a battle is not peaceful. It is the silence of people taking stock of what is broken and what is not, of hands shaking now that there is no longer anything to grip, of voices calling names and waiting to hear the answer. I moved through it with Mokjae and two of the apprentices, checking the wall, checking the crews, counting. Every wounded one to the lab, none left behind. I said it loudly enough for the nearest crews to hear, and then I said it again as I moved further along. We hold this town like we built it, like nobody's expendable. Seo-rin fell into step beside me, her notebook still open, her face carrying the particular expression she wore when she was recording something she wanted to remember exactly. Castoffs and orphans and one madman from the sky, she said. We held against the court itself. I did not have an answer for that wasn't smaller than the fact, so I kept moving. Ryu Gyeom was already on his horse when I caught sight of him through the gate's iron bars, a figure in court colors, picking his way through the wreckage of his own army's retreat, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who has not yet decided what he is. He did not look back at the wall. I think he was doing the arithmetic that I had done months ago when I first understood what the mandate's failure meant. The old world was not failing, it was already gone. It had been gone for longer than anyone had admitted, and the only question now was what came next. They beat the mandate with grease and arithmetic and a girl who feels iron. I did not hear him think it, but I knew the shape of the thought because I had watched him reach for his power and find nothing, and I knew what that moment does to a man who has built everything on one foundation and watched it give way. He paused at the edge of the valley, not quite far enough away to be safe from the cannon, and turned his horse just enough to look back, not at the wall, at me, or at the space I occupied. This isn't finished, Outlander. His voice carried in the cold air with the clarity of a man who has learned to project authority even when the authority is gone. But I no longer know which of us it ends well for. Then he rode. G found me in the afternoon when the wounded had been moved and the guns had been secured and the wall had been walked twice by Dogwang's people to confirm it was still sound. She stood with me at the parapet and looked out at the empty valley, and she said what she had been thinking since the volley. You've shown every dying frontier there's another way to live. I thought about the towns I had passed through on the road to Iron Ridge, the ones where the veil was failing and the people were leaving because they did not know what to do when the magic stopped. The ones where the ore was in the ground and the coal was in the ground and the limestone was in the ground and nobody had the tools to reach any of it because the tools had always been the mandate's work and the mandate was dying. Let them want it, I said. We'll teach every last one. That's how the old world ends, with everyone learning they can make their own. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once and went back to her people. The three of us, Baektaeho, Choyoung, and I, ended up in the forge hall as the light failed, the way we had ended up there so many times before. Not by arrangement, just by the pull of the place where the work had happened. The lathe stood in its corner. The mill stood beside it. The grinder, the measuring tools on their rack, each in its place, each the product of a process that had produced the process, that had produced the cannon, that had just turned back an army. Taeho ran his hand along the lathe bed the way he always did, feeling for the truth of the surface, the thing that could not be seen but only felt by hands that had learned to read it. His face was the face of a man trying to find words for something that did not have words yet in this world. We made the things that just saved us all. He shook his head slowly. My grandfather would not have a word for this. Choyoung looked at the machines the way she looked at iron, not at the surface, but at the structure, the ratio, the curve of force to result. She had started as a girl who measured by feel and become something that had no name yet either, a metrologist of a kind that this world had not produced before, a person whose hands were a standard. I do, she said. Ours. We made it ours, and nobody can take it back. I had been thinking about the next problem since the volley. That is the engineer's habit. The battle is still happening, and part of your mind is already 3 steps ahead, already at the constraint that the current solution has revealed. We had the tool set, we had the method, we had people who knew the process and could teach it and would teach it. What we did not have was the raw material to feed what we had built. The lathe needed iron, the mill needed iron, the cannon needed iron, the next cannon needed iron, and the cannon after that, and the tools we would send to the next dying frontier needed iron. We had been working with scavenged stock, bought iron, traded iron, iron that came to us already shaped by someone else's process and someone else's decisions about quality. We had been feeding a machine that could eat a mountain on scraps from other people's tables. Lathe, mill, grinder, power, done. I looked at the machines, at the work they represented, at the season of work ahead of them, but they're hungry, and we've been feeding them scraps. Time to give them a mountain, time to make our own steel. Taeho looked at me. He knew what that meant. Blast furnace, mine, the whole chain from ore to finished metal under our own hands and our own control. He had been a forge master long enough to know the difference between working with someone else's iron and working with iron you had made yourself from the ground up. His expression said he had been waiting for this conversation. Do-gwang found me later, when the forge hall had gone quiet and the lamps were burning low. He was moving better than he had in months. The legs still gave him trouble on stairs, but on level ground he had found a rhythm with it. The way a machine finds the groove it runs in once the parts have worn to fit each other. He stood in the doorway of the forge hall and looked at the machines and at me, and his face held the particular expression of a man reviewing a road he had traveled and finding it stranger than he expected. From a stool I held a wall against the court, he said. Strange road, Smith. I thought about the stool, about the man who had sat on it in the early days, watching the apprentices drill, calling corrections, learning the rhythm of command from a position that should have been humiliating and making it into something else entirely. About the wall today, and his voice moving along it like a tool finding its work. And it goes a lot further yet. I looked at the lathe, at the mill, at the tools on their rack, then past them, at the window and the dark mountain beyond it. Steel next, then a heart that burns, an engine, then a machine that carries us anywhere. I felt the weight of the distance ahead, and it was not a discouraging weight, it was the weight of work that was worth doing. We're barely past the foundation. Outside, the veil over Iron Ridge still held, thinner than it had been, pale as ice, but holding. Below it, in the forge hall and the lab and the barracks and the houses where the Castoffs and the orphans and the one madman from the sky had made something that had no name yet in this world, the lamps burned on through the night. The mountain waited.